Imagine this. You're alone in a bathroom. You flush, step back, and suddenly there's that smell. You don't have to think about it. Your face tightens. You want to lean away, maybe hold your breath, maybe get out of there as fast as possible. Now here's the weird question. Why does poop smell bad? Not what chemicals are in it, not what bacteria live there, but why does your brain insist this smell is disgusting instead of pleasant or neutral? Because somewhere in our evolutionary past, if there were humans who thought that smell was nice, who liked playing with it, touching it, tasting it, they probably got sick more often. They probably died younger. And they probably left fewer children. Over thousands of generations, the genes that didn't make you disgusted by feces disappeared. And the genes that made you think, nope, when you smell it, those genes stayed. That is natural selection in action. But here's the real twist. When we say natural selection, what exactly is being selected? Most people, if you ask them, will say something like, survival of the fittest individual, the strongest animal, the best adapted person. That sounds reasonable. The better individual survives and has more kids. Seems obvious. But then nature does something very confusing. Worker bees will defend their hive, even if stinging means they die. Female worker ants are sterile. They work themselves to death for a colony in which they never have their own children. Squirrels stand up on a rock and shout alarm calls that draw attention to themselves, just to warn other squirrels there's a hawk. They're not acting selfish at all. Sometimes they die because they're helping. So, if evolution is just about the fittest individual, why do we see so much self-sacrifice? Maybe, you might think, it's about the species. Survival of the fittest species. The individual's sacrifice to help the group survive. That sounds nice, but there's a problem. Species don't really reproduce the way individuals do. You don't typically get one whole species making a copy of itself, then those two species competing, and one going extinct. Natural selection needs copies and a filter. Many copies are made, some survive, some don't. Individuals make copies of themselves. Species don't. So if it's not really about the fittest individual, and not really about the fittest species, what is evolution actually selecting? To answer that, we have to go back. Way back. The world before life. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the early Earth. No trees, no fish, no animals, no people. Just a hot planet with oceans, rocks, lightning, volcanoes, and a thick atmosphere full of simple molecules. Think of them like tiny, invisible blobs drifting around. Carbon dioxide, nitrogen compounds, simple organics. Nothing that thinks, nothing that wants anything, just chemistry. Every now and then, one of these blobs gets a blast of energy. Maybe from lightning, maybe from ultraviolet light from the sun, maybe from heat near a volcano. Most of the time, when blobs bump into each other, nothing interesting happens. They just separate again. But sometimes, very rarely, 2 or 3 blobs stick together and form a more complex molecule. That new combination might be more stable than the pieces were on their own, so it hangs around a little longer. If you speed this story up in your mind, millions of years per second, you can picture the environment as a chaos of collisions and accidents, molecules constantly forming and breaking apart, more complex structures appearing and disappearing. And then, at some point, something happens that changes everything. By pure chance, a molecule appears, or maybe a small group of molecules, that has a very special property. When it's surrounded by the right ingredients, that structure can cause a copy of itself to form. Think about that for a second. Most molecules just sit there, waiting to be broken apart. This one doesn't just exist. It makes more of itself. It doesn't have a goal. It doesn't want to replicate. It just happens to be a shape that pulls other bits together in a way that builds another copy. This is the first replicator. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8. Given enough time and enough raw materials, this one type of structure can fill its environment with copies of itself, like ink spreading through water. So now, our early Earth isn't just random chaos anymore. It's chaos, plus a new rule. Anything that can make copies of itself will tend to become more common. That is the seed of evolution. Replicators, mutation, and competition. Of course, no copying process is perfect. Once in a while, when a replicator makes a copy, an error sneaks in. Maybe a different atom gets used. Maybe radiation hits at the wrong moment. Maybe a bond forms at a slightly different angle. Most of these changes make the copy worse, less stable, more fragile, easier to break. Some do nothing at all. But once in a while, by sheer luck, a change makes the copy a better replicator. Maybe it survives a little longer before breaking down. Maybe it uses ingredients more efficiently. Maybe it copies faster. Now imagine not just one replicator, but many. They all need the same limited building blocks. They all share the same environment. Our planet becomes a battlefield of invisible replicators, each trying, without any intention, to outcopy the others. The ones that are more stable, that break less often, that copy more accurately and more quickly, they tend to win. They get more and more common. The ones that copy badly, that fall apart easily, get filtered out. That filtering process is natural selection. And the thing being selected is not species. It's not even entire organisms, because organisms don't exist yet. What's being selected is the replicator itself. Fast forward billions of years. Those early replicators have become incredibly sophisticated. They've surrounded themselves with protective layers, invented ways to store energy, discovered chemical tools to sense the environment, and eventually built complicated shells, skins, bones, eyes, brains. We have a word for those shells today: organisms, bacteria, plants, animals, you, me. But deep inside every cell of every living thing, the original logic is still running. Structures that copy themselves well become more common. Structures that don't disappear. Today we call those replicators genes. Survival machines for genes. Inside your cells, genes are long stretches of DNA, sequences of A, T, G, and C. Each gene is like a tiny instruction that influences some trait: how your enzymes work, how your eyes develop, how your brain responds to certain chemicals. But here's the key idea, the one that makes this whole story controversial. From one point of view, you are not the main character. You, your body, your personality, your feelings, are a temporary survival machine built by genes to help themselves get copied into the next generation. You are a robot made of meat, carrying a library of chemical recipes that have been competing and cooperating for billions of years. That's the core of what's often called the selfish gene perspective. Selfish here doesn't mean evil. Genes don't think. They don't have motives. But some gene variants are better at getting themselves copied than others. Those are the ones that dominate. This way of seeing evolution is powerful because it helps explain things that look very mysterious if you focus only on individuals or species. Let's go back to that squirrel sounding an alarm. Why animals sometimes risk their lives. Imagine a population of ground squirrels living in a field. In this field, hawks are always scanning from above, looking for something small and furry to eat. When a hawk appears, a squirrel has two basic options. Option 1, stay quiet, hide, and hope the hawk doesn't notice. Option 2, stand up, shout an alarm call, and warn the others. While making yourself more obvious, from the point of view of a single squirrel, screaming seems stupid. It might get you killed. But now zoom in on the genes. Each squirrel got half of its genes from its mother and half from its father. It shares roughly half of its genes with its siblings. It shares many of the same genes with cousins, aunts, uncles, and parents. In many ground squirrel populations, females tend to live near their relatives. Their neighbors are their sisters, cousins, and nieces. So imagine there is a gene that makes a squirrel more likely to give an alarm call when it sees a hawk. If a squirrel carrying that gene screams and dies, that gene loses its chance to be passed on through her future babies. But if that scream saves 3 of her sisters, each of whom also carries that same gene, then overall, that gene may still come out ahead. It has sacrificed 1 copy of itself inside the caller to protect more copies inside her relatives. From the gene's perspective, there is no difference between being inside this body or that body. A copy is a copy. This is called kin selection, helping relatives because they likely share your genes. The same logic applies to worker bees that sacrifice themselves for the hive, or sterile ants that labor for a queen they will never replace, or wolves that share food with pack members. On the surface, it looks like group survival. Under the hood, it's often genes helping copies of themselves in related bodies. That's why the question, who survives, can be misleading. The deeper question is, which genes become more common in the population over time? So are we just gene robots? At this point, the selfish gene view can feel unsettling. It can sound like you have no real agency, that every decision you make is just DNA pulling strings. You fall in love? That's your genes trying to reproduce. You care about your family? That's kin selection. You help strangers and feel compassion? Maybe those are strategies too. Helping your reputation, building cooperation that ultimately benefits your genes. It can feel a bit grim, but there are a few important clarifications. First, calling genes selfish is a metaphor. Molecules don't think, plan, or care. They just are. When we say a gene is selfish, we mean versions of that gene that happen to promote their own copying become more common. That's it. Second, genes are not simple on-off switches. It's not one gene, sound one behavior. One gene can affect many traits. One trait can be influenced by many genes. Some genes turn others on or off. The environment, your childhood, your diet, your culture, changes how genes are expressed. So genes bias you. They tilt the table. But they don't write every move you make. Third, evolution is not just ruthless optimization. There is also chance. When randomness beats the fittest. To see how, imagine a small group of blind cave fish. Half of them carry a gene that makes their eyes slightly green. Half carry a gene that makes their eyes slightly blue. Because they live in total darkness and are already blind, eye color does nothing for them. It doesn't change survival at all. If you follow this population generation after generation, purely by chance, the frequency of green and blue may drift. In one generation, you might have a few more green. In another, a few more blue. In a small population, this random fluctuation, called genetic drift, can be so strong that one version wins out even though it's not better. One color might completely take over just by luck. And drift doesn't only affect trivial traits in noisy, complex environments. Sometimes even slightly worse genes can spread, simply because of random sampling and the chaos of life. So evolution is not a perfect engineer. It's a messy process of selection plus accidents. The selfish gene view doesn't deny that. It just says, whenever a gene variant has any consistent effect on its own chances of being passed on, good or bad, natural selection can act on it. Why this view is so controversial. So why do biologists argue about this? One reason is that the selfish gene framing can easily be misunderstood. It can sound like every single gene in your genome is there because it was ruthlessly selected for, and every trait must have some deep adaptive story. In reality, many parts of our DNA seem almost invisible to selection. Some stretches don't code for proteins. Some changes are neutral. Some traits may be historical accidents or side effects. There's an ongoing debate about how much of evolution is driven by direct selection on genes and how much is just drift in history. Another reason is that focusing only on genes can feel narrow. What about the role of groups, or ecosystems, or cultural evolution? Things like language, ideas, technology? Those also change over time and affect survival. In recent years, some researchers have proposed multi-level selection, the idea that selection can act at the level of genes, individuals, groups, even species, depending on the situation. So is the selfish gene theory wrong? Not exactly. Think of it more like a powerful lens. It's not the only way to look at evolution, but when you put it on, many confusing behaviors suddenly become clear. Altruism, family loyalty, risk-taking, even your disgust at certain smells. And importantly, it reminds us of something deep. Natural selection does not care about fairness. It does not care about happiness. It doesn't even care about you as a person. What it cares about, in a cold, mechanical sense, is which patterns of information manage to stick around. Genes that build brains that think they are the main character can be very successful genes. What this means for us. So where does this leave you? On one level, you can say, I am a survival machine for my genes. Your instincts, your fear of disease, your love for your family, your attraction to certain people, your tendency to take risks or play it safe, have all been shaped, at least partly, by what helped genes survive in ancient environments. That helps explain why some of your reactions feel so automatic, why you can know something logically, and still feel something very different emotionally. On another level, though, you are not just your genes. You are also a mind that can model the world, tell stories, reflect on your own behavior, and even rebel against your instincts. You can choose not to have children. You can choose to help strangers on the other side of the planet. You can override your disgust to work as a doctor, a nurse, a cleaner, someone who handles the gross parts of life for the benefit of others. In a strange way, understanding how genes shaped you can give you more freedom, not less. If you know that some of your gut reactions come from ancient survival rules that may not fit the modern world, you can question them. You can ask, is this feeling really helping me? Or just my genes? Do I want to act on this impulse knowing where it comes from? And you can decide what kind of person you want to be, in spite of the selfish molecules riding inside your cells. Back to the bathroom. Let's go back to that bathroom for a moment. Poop smells bad to you because the genes that made people like that smell didn't make it very far. Those genes lost the ancient survival game. Your disgust is a tiny echo of billions of years of chemical warfare, replication, mutation, and selection, all the way from lifeless blobs on early Earth to a human with a phone in their hand and a very strong opinion about what does and does not smell okay. You are, in one sense, a vehicle built by genes to help them survive. But you are also the only thing on this planet, as far as we know, that can understand that fact, and then decide what to do with it. And maybe that, the ability to look at your own programming, is the most controversial idea in biology of all, because it asks a very simple, very unsettling question. If your genes built your brain to serve them, what will you choose to do next?